speaker this evening is Claire Harford. Claire has a degree in science from the University of Western Australia and is the current state coordinator for the Australian Youth Climate Coalition. She's particularly interested in youth engagement on policy issues of climate change and education, believing firmly that young people have the power to make change from an unexpected perspective. Please join me in welcoming Claire.
So that's an incredibly humbling, well, I'm in an incredibly humbling position to be speaking after these lovely two women up the front, so thank you so much. So, as has just been mentioned, my name is Claire. I'm one of two actual state coordinators for the Australian Youth Climate Coalition in WA. And I've been asked to take a few minutes to introduce myself and talk a little bit about how I first became involved in the Australian Youth Climate Coalition and in fact climate change advocacy. So in order for my motivations to actually make any sense, you first need to know that I'm a child of oil and gas. So my father and his grandfather have worked for the same resource company all over the world for the last 60 years. It was 7 years ago that I remember first being confronted by the polarising nature of climate change. I was asked by my employer in a room of his friends exactly how I felt about my dad's industry being the cause of the impending environmental apocalypse. Even now, I think knowing what I know, being here speaking to all of you, I would have reacted exactly the same way, which was incredibly defensively. I don't know whether anyone else in this room remembers the earlier climate warnings we had, painting pictures of a dead world with no possible positive outcome for humanity, but I do. And I remember the people painting that picture for my future being the same people who wanted me to feel guilty for my family and my history. I think I ended up becoming so annoyed by people trying to make me and everyone else choose a side than what was set up to be the climate change debate between industry and environment. As time went on, a sense of rationality begged me to look past these things and to start paying attention to what was really happening to the world climate. I think we can all agree that the science is conclusive. So the climate is changing, and this change is exacerbated by human activity. We can agree that climate change isn't just an issue of the environment, but also an issue of social justice, with people already losing their land due to sea levels rising. And of energy as well. So if we can't use fossil fuels, how are we going to keep powering ourselves? These were questions of opportunity for me, and eventually I reached a point where I wanted to be proactive and outspoken on an issue that I didn't feel had been given a fair public trial. I was so frustrated by our tendency to look absolutely miserable while throwing blame around. I wondered why industry and action had to be an opposing duality in our path forward. The AICC was actually almost a best fit model. They were the only ones talking about climate change in terms of a blameless, positive solution. And so 2 years ago, I began volunteering with them. I know our historical relationship with fossil fuels is really complicated, but our mandate for change is very clear. And with that, I'd like to introduce the AICC and the role in positive action we are having as an organisation in Australia and in fact the world. So just out of interest and more for my own personal curiosity, how many people have actually heard of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition? Hey, nice. Okay, job, that's great. So the AICC is a grassroots organisation that engages over 90,000 young Australians in the issue of climate change. Just to put that in perspective, that's actually larger than the two mailing lists of the two major parties in Australia combined. We are the largest youth-led organisation in Australia and have maintained steady community pressure on state, federal and international leaders since our inception in 2007. So what this really means is that young people from all over Australia have been supported to act on local issues that are important to them. So in WA, we have groups from Geraldton to Bunbury working on everything from anti-fracking to coal to transitioning local businesses to green energy. Because people are being supported in advocating issues that are most important to them, We are locally relevant at all times and connected as a united movement that remains responsive to politics and policy of the day. When I actually read the invitation from Flavia to come and speak tonight, I actually recoiled a little at the use of the term activism, and I know we've touched on that a little already tonight. Without wanting to open the debate about the effectiveness of public demonstration, I'll just explain what I mean in terms of Google and global public perception of the word. So when the world types activism into Google, these are the images that bounce back. We have images of violence on the ground in Palestine. We have women protesting the sex trade in Ukraine. We have images of a strong military force against civilians during Greek elections. And we have a Tibetan man protesting a visit by Chinese government officials to India. I think you'll actually agree with me that all of these images contain content that is foreign to our everyday lives. Experiences that are distinctly not something that a large number of Australians would wish to be a part of. Activism is perceived as a term that nods, at least in part, to extreme action. And I think in this way we sometimes do ourselves a disservice by calling what we do activism. I remember telling my mum a couple of years ago that I was volunteering for a climate change organisation. In a moment of candour, she admitted to me that she was preparing herself for me to be arrested. Well, for those of you who know me, that might sound hilarious. It's not actually an uncommon perception or fear about modern environmentalism. So the original environmental movement of the 60s was a lot less cohesive with mainstream culture than the actions we take today, and I'd like to think tonight is a little bit of a rebranding exercise for the word. So just to clarify, I'm not saying that different forms of demonstration are ineffective, but they are incredibly different to the kinds of activism that AYCC does. And that's important because climate change, as you all know in here, affects everyone, and all Australians need to be part of the solution. We can't actually afford to isolate people from our movement, and it would be a problem if we were separating ourselves and our ideals from the mainstream by the actions that we take. A heartening study actually released by CSIRO earlier this year tells us that upwards of 90% of Western Australians understand that climate change is happening. For me, this is incredible and shows me that our ideas are at least halfway to becoming mainstream. So in light of all of this, I want to talk about what kind of activism AYCC actually does. So what images come to mind when I say things like best climate change campaign of the election? Do you think of an incredible political speech or a famous name coming in support of an issue? We know to both of those things, and the answer would actually be a youth-funded fish called Nemo, who's actually a follow-up to our climate elephant in 2010. Our activities have been published in the Fin Review, the Age, the Herald, online in a million places, including Crikey and the Conversation, as well as broadcast on things like ABC News. So, we've caused a bit of noise, and that's one thing, but maybe you're wondering if this actually achieves anything, or if an organisation can hope to make lasting change at all. I'll cite just a couple of stories here. So, locally, my predecessors were actually approached by the campaigners for the proposed Fremantle wind farm. They'd been working on their plan for quite a while, but struggling to demonstrate widespread community support for the project, and they weren't going to get a meeting with the Premier without that established support. We were able to tap into our networks and show that there is most definitely community support for renewable energy in Fremantle. The result, I believe, was a meeting with the Premier and ongoing negotiations with the Fremantle Port Authority. At a national level, in 2011, we ran a campaign where 1,000 volunteers from all over Australia actually asked for meetings with their local members to talk about pricing carbon. Collectively as a state, we met with most of our politicians, although WA had the only 2 members in the country who refused to meet with volunteers. During this campaign, our actions were discussed in federal parliament, and we actually managed to have meetings with the Prime Minister as a direct result of this nationwide community support for pricing carbon. Politicians explicitly said that without the demonstrated community support that our organisation provided, it would have been harder for them to support a price on carbon. So I guess our theory is pretty simple. Young people understand that climate change is happening, and if our government isn't going to stand up and be brave, and if our industries are going to keep investing in technology that is detrimental to our world, then we have proven to ourselves and our government that we're strong enough and loud enough to make a difference. A co-founder of the AYCC, Anna Rose, can be paraphrased as saying, "You should never let anyone tell young people that they're the leaders of tomorrow, because they're already leading today." And I think we've shown everyone that time and time again. So what about today? So what are we doing? I was talking with a lead renewables campaigner in Australia a couple of months ago actually, and she shared a story that I'd actually like to share with you now. A few years ago, she was really concerned about climate change. She knew the government wasn't doing enough, and so she arranged a meeting with her local member, who was then, and still, Federal Minister Anthony Albanese. Lindsay said that she went to this meeting, she sat down, and she laid out the science. She spoke about her concern that the government wasn't doing enough to address the worst impacts of climate change, and she worried about her kids and the world she was going to leave for them. Minister Albanese was quiet, and he listened, and he finally responded with, "Lindsay, I know." He told her that he understood the science, and he understood that the government wasn't doing enough, his government wasn't doing enough, and that he also had a child, and he was scared about the world that his child was going to inherit. His last comments were that until he heard from every corner of Australia that Australians want strong government action on climate change, he was stuck. This isn't a criticism of Mr Albanese or, in fact, the Labor government, but it is insight into how our political system works. We have a reactive government which exists to respond to the people. So this Saturday, I'll be out with 50 of the most incredible volunteers you can imagine, asking every Western Australian to vote for the climate this election. We have an independently reviewed scorecard, which I've popped up there, and there are actually copies up the back, which we hope to put in the hands of thousands of West Australians, explaining to people that the power is actually in our hands. I guess I just want to leave you with this. So if you or any young person you know is feeling disheartened or like nothing can be done to solve climate change, then I think all you have to do is search for the collective that's making the biggest noise. And this year, and this election, at least in Western Australia, I'd like to believe that we're a force to be reckoned with. Thank you.
Should we go over time by like 10 minutes or something for Q&A? Okay. Can you guys come up here, please?